But it may surprise a few people to know that the 2nd Battalion of the North Devonshire Regiment of Foot was 96% Irishmen. Swiss regiments were very steady, very well trained, well drilled. Favourite obscure regiment is the Greek Light Infantry, and this was actually a unit on the British Army list and did actually do service in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Rather late business, isn't it, Delancey? Killing.
The British Army of the Napoleonic Wars, heroic, effective, and also, frankly, a bit confusing, to say the least. Well, never fear, because today myself and guest Steve Brown are getting stuck into some fascinating subjects. How did regiments get their county affiliation, and did it really mean anything? How many British Army regiments were actually foreign? What was the most obscure unit, and which regiments were the best and worst? Stick with us today to find out the answers to all those questions.
So when we read about the Peninsular War, we see regimental numbers, and we also often see county names. An example I'm thinking of would be 24th Regiment of Foot, 2nd Warwicks. Did these county names actually mean anything? I know later on we had the Cardwell reforms and so forth where that was formalised. But at this point, did it really mean anything? If you were the 17th, were you full of Leicestershire lads or not?
By and large, no. You've got to look at how these names arose in the first place. Because up until about 1751, regiments were not numbered. They were known by the name of their colonels. So there was, at one point, I think it was in the 1740s, when there were two regiments that had colonels named Howard. So to differentiate them, they called one the Buff Howards and the other one the Green Howards, after the colour of their facings. And of course, those names have stayed on till today.
Yeah,
Steady the Buff, all that. And in 1751, they got numbered in accordance with seniority, so that depending on when they originally got raised, they were given numbers from 1 through to 1751. There were probably about 50 or 50-something regiments, but they had no regional affiliation at all. They just got men wherever they could get them, basically. And in 1782, it was felt that there should be a desire to foster some relationship between regiments and recruiting grounds, and that if a regiment was allocated to a county, you'd get this swell of pride of people in that particular county wanting to join that particular regiment. So what they did was they wrote to all the regimental colonels, and so Horse Guards wrote to all the regimental colonels and said, we're going to give you all secondary titles. Ideally, it would be based upon your current, favourite recruiting grounds. Please nominate a county. And most regimental colonels just wrote back and nominated the county that they were from.
Brilliant.
So they basically took all these responses, put them all into a hat and tried to work out what to do with it. And there were a lot of popular counties and there were a number of less popular counties. And what they had to do was the counties that were more popular, the less senior regiments had to make do with one of the less popular counties.
Right.
So sort of compilation.
Yeah.
And you get weird things happening, like the 10th Foot at the time in 1782. The regimental colonel was from Northumberland, and he requested Northumberland, but they were given North Lincolnshire. The 20th asked for Lancashire, and they got Eastern Devonshire. So for a while, from 1782, certainly up until the time of Waterloo, these names didn't actually mean all that much, because by and large, recruiting parties took men wherever they could get them, and they
generally
got a third of them in Ireland.
Yeah, I was about to say.
And some of the regiments were given titles. For example, the Royal Fusiliers already had a title, and they felt they didn't need another title. They were given Derbyshire, which they just promptly ignored. So some of the regiments that already had titles, and I'm looking for an example here, like, for example, the 42nd with the Royal Highland, or the Black Watch, they didn't change, and some of the other regiments that already had established, some of the Fusilier regiments, for example, just maintained, and particularly the Royal Regiment. The 1st Foot remained the Royal Regiment, and the 2nd Foot remained the Queen's, and the 4th Foot remained the King's Own. They didn't even attempt to impose county titles upon them.
And they actually could, as we alluded to, recruit anywhere, really, couldn't they? So, I mean, have you come across in your research any sense of percentages of, for example, the one I always think of because I'm from Leicester, the 17th, Leicestershire Regiment. Would you have come across, would they have meant anything in terms of recruitment? Like, let's look here, the 49th Hertfordshires. Would they have had a lot of Hertfordshire lads, or was it just window dressing, basically?
So much of it was window dressing. I mean, I wrote a regimental history of the 45th Foot.
The Nottinghams.
Yes, the 1st Nottinghamshire. The 2nd Battalion was raised in Mansfield, and it spent a bit of time in Nottinghamshire, so that's, sort of stuck with its affiliation. But the 1st Battalion of the 45th Foot, which was formed in 1740, didn't march through Nottingham until I think it was the 1850s.
Oh, wow.
First time it visited Nottingham. What I've done as part of my the work that I've done on King George's Army is looking at the demographics of the various units to try and work out whether there's any kind of correlation between their name and where they get their men from. And I've now extended that all the way through to the 104th Foot, and at some point in time I intend to turn that into a perhaps more scholarly article that I'll put out in journals and stuff like that to try and wrap it all up, because there's a lot of good information that probably should be out there. Obviously there were some regiments that were extremely English, and the 1st and the Coldstream Foot Guards rarely dropped below 95% of Englishmen within the ranks.
Oh, wow.
A lot of the 2nd battalions were raised from Army Reserve units that were raised in specific counties. So therefore No, Army of Reserve in 1803 and 1804, they raised a whole bunch of Army Reserve units, a sort of second-line infantry, I guess you'd call it.
Wow.
The second 10th was formed from Army Reserve men from Lincolnshire, so unsurprising that it contains a lot of local people and English, of course. And the Black Watch, so far, it comes across as the most Scottish regiment, 95%, which is unsurprising. But it may surprise a few people to know that the 2nd Battalion of the North Devonshire Regiment of Foot was 96% Irishmen. Wow. As was the 2nd Battalion of the 44th East Essex was 91% Irishmen. So it really just goes to show what a sort of window dressing kind of thing this was. Yeah. And the 60th Foot, which I guess we can sort of guess was by and large not English. In fact, it was extremely not English, because the 5th and the 7th Battalions were almost entirely foreigners.
Yeah.
English officers, and that was about it.
And despite the name, not many Americans too, I don't think.
Again, even the name is a bit of window dressing, because that's where it was raised back in the 1750s, but it hadn't been to America for a very long time.
Yeah. Mainly sort of Hungarians, Germans, all sorts, wasn't it?
Oh, you name it. Yeah.
But things get even stranger, because now we're off to meet the Corsicans, the Greeks, and even some ex-cons, all proudly fighting in British uniform. Sort of.
We've talked about the 5th 60th Rifles, of course, and obviously there was the Chasseurs Britanniques and others. Could you give us a bit of a rundown? What were some of the foreign corps that were fighting as part of the British Army in those days, and how effective were they? Were they any good?
The next slide along provides a summary from the 1815 Army List, which is a pretty fulsome summary. At one point in time, there were 12 regiments raised in the West Indies, although somewhat confusingly they're referred to as West India regiments, not West Indies regiments. By 1815, there were only 8 of them remaining, but they were, by and large, raised on the basis that the officers were British Army officers and the other ranks were, for the most part, former slaves. There were 4 regiments raised in Ceylon, or Sri Lanka as it is nowadays. There were a whole bunch of miscellaneous regiments from literally all over the world. There was the Royal African Corps on the west coast of Africa. There was a couple of regiments raised for general service in the West Indies, such as the Royal York Rangers, the West India Rangers, and the York Chasseurs. Yeah, there was the Cape Regiment at Cape Town. The Bourbon Regiment, which was based in Mauritius. There were garrison companies literally all over the place. There was a veteran company based in New South Wales. There were various Royal Veteran Garrison battalions, which really were raised, albeit by and large from more senior retirement age British servicemen who were looking for a garrison role rather than an active role.
So you could sort of volunteer for that, could you? If you were, in I don't know, first battalion of whatever, and you'd done 20 years and you wanted to wrap it up, you could put your hand up for one of these units.
I dare say you could, but often when battalions were discharging groups of, I'd call it old and worn out men, albeit in their 40s,
Yeah.
they'd often send the best ones to the garrison and the veteran battalions, and they basically had garrison duty, which freed up regular regiments for active service. So
Gotcha.
they performed quite important role. There were 5 units of Canadian fencibles, Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, Glengarry, which are mostly Scots, the Canadian fencibles, and the New Brunswick fencibles. And they were only for service in British North America, or Canada, as we'd call it. And then there were a whole bunch of units which were referred to as foreign corps. So they weren't considered to be quite part of the British Army, but they were associated with the British Army. And you have, of course, the King's German Legion, who need no introduction.
Yeah.
The Duke of Brunswick Owls, Jagers. 3 Swiss regiments, which were taken to British service in about the turn of the 19th century, which were quite good, quite steady troops and saw service on the east coast of Spain. The York Light Infantry Volunteers, which was actually a penal battalion, raised for service in North America, mostly ex-convicts. The Royal Corsican Rangers, a Sicilian regiment, the 1st Greek Light Infantry, and ultimately there was a 2nd Greek Light Infantry, and a foreign veteran battalion. So you've got all sorts of weird and wonderful units there, with all sorts of interesting, weird and wonderful uniforms, which you may see on the next slide, all doing duty with the British Army, particularly at a time when it was at its peak, which was 1813 or thereabouts, when the British Army had about 300,000 men. These were all part and parcel of that.
So you mentioned some fascinating sounding units there. I mean, I didn't realise the York, what were they called? The York Rangers. I didn't realise they were a penal regiment.
York Light Infantry Volunteers.
Would they have been foreign or were they British convicts?
It's a bit of both, but mostly British. And when they were disbanded, most of, or a very large proportion of the men, took up land grants in Canada.
Well, let's move on. So, of all these units we've discussed, and there's some pretty odd ones to say the least, what do you think was the most obscure that you've come across, or the most interesting at least?
My favourite obscure regiment is the Greek Light Infantry, which hopefully the next slide will show.
Oh, look at that uniform.
Who wore a sort of variant of Greek national costume, albeit with a red coat. And the officers wore sort of a cavalry helmet with a plume, extremely oriental sabres, scimitars, I guess you'd call them, and again, a variant of the Greek national costume. And this was actually a unit on the British Army list and did actually do service in the Eastern Mediterranean for a period before it was disbanded in, I think, about 1816.
And what have you found out about their service? Were they particularly effective, or were they, a bit of a waste of time?
I don't know that they saw a lot of active service. I think they did mostly garrison duty, and I suspect it was in the Ionian Islands off the Greek coast. I don't know that there
nice gig.
Many in anger, but they probably had a nice lifestyle, I would think.
Would they have been British officers? I mean, would Johnny
Yes.
from Eton have dressed like this chap on screen now?
Well, Johnny from Eton may not elect to join that particular regiment.
True.
But certainly the commanding officer was a guy named Richard Church, who was an Irishman, and it did have British officers, but it also did have some Greek officers and Sicilian and Corsican officers as well. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. But I'm assuming all orders were in English, but I'm not quite sure what the Greeks made of it.
So, of the foreign regiments, how battle-worthy, how battle-ready were they, and did they prove to be effective in action?
For the most part, yes. The King's German Legion regiments were the equivalent of British Army regiments for all intents and purposes. And the cavalry was arguably better than some British cavalry units. So There was no qualms whatsoever about calling the King's German Legion a top quality formation. The Swiss regiments were very steady, very well trained, well drilled, steady. They had low rates of drunkenness and all that kind of thing. The Canadian fencible regiments in North America did good service and were extremely reliable. the Corsican Regiment, Corsican Rangers, had somewhat of a reputation as crack shots and very, very good light infantry. In fact, I think they were at Maida, or a detachment of them was at Maida, where they were particularly good at sharpshooting and hiding behind rocks and acting as your typical sort of classic light infantry. So, they were quite good.
And were they actually from Corsica, Steve, or was that another one of those names that doesn't mean anything?
Yeah, no, they were actually from Corsica, and they actually had Corsican officers, although there obviously was a lot of British officers. In terms of the ones that perhaps are less glamorous, probably the Chasseurs Britanniques tend to attract negative attention. Originally started out as a Royalist regiment, and when they had the Royalist regiments, the Royalist recruits in the ranks in the late 1790s, early 1800s, they were probably a pretty reliable regiment. But by the time they got to Peninsula, they were literally drafting French POWs into their ranks to make up the numbers, and the desertion rate was through the roof, which I suppose was unsurprising. But when pressed, they could do the thing on the day. But there's an awful lot of troops that never really saw much in the way of action. They did mostly garrison duty, and I'm thinking, the New South Wales Corps, the Ceylonese Regiment, the Maltese Regiment, the Bourbon Regiment, the Cape Regiment didn't really have to do all that much in terms of real fighting.
Yeah.
The West Indies Regiment, some of them did get involved. There's a West Indies Regiment at New Orleans in early 1815, and particularly at the capture of Martinique and Guadeloupe in 1809 and 1810, and they seem to have done good service there. They seem to be well regarded.
I think, were they also at Bladensburg or the March on Washington, something like that? I don't know. I've got a vague recollection.
There was certainly, some colonial Marines, and there may have been a West Indian regiment. It might have been the 5th, certainly involved at that time.
That's probably a nice sort of segue. We're discussing regiments, quirky regiments, interesting units. What would you say, and I'm going to put you on the spot here, Steve, this is a difficult one. We hear a lot about the 95th Rifles, we hear a lot about the Guards. From your research, which units would you say were perhaps a little overrated? And on the flip side of that, are there units you've come across that you think were really underrated and deserve a lot more attention?
I do think there were units that were overrated, but they were only overrated for a specific reason or for a limited period of time. And I'm going to upset the cavalry folks here by picking out two in particular. The first being the 18th Hussars, or the Royal Irish Hussars, who were one of 4 regiments, light dragoon regiments, given conversion to a Hussar regiment in 1806, and all the men were ordered to grow Mongol moustaches. They had an extremely expensive and fancy uniform. They had a very high opinion of themselves. They were quite a dashing and dandified set. The regimental colonel of the 18th Hussars was the Marquis of Drogheda, I'm not quite sure how that's pronounced, who was, I think, about 90 at the time of Waterloo. They didn't go to the Peninsula until about April 1813, when all 4 Hussar regiments were sent out to Spain and formed into a brigade. And right from the get-go, people could see that there was something not right with them.
Yeah.
About 3 months after arrival, they got bumped out of the Hussar Brigade, put into a separate brigade with the 1st Hussars of the King's German Legion. And the 1st Hussars of the King's German Legion were unquestionably, and I think just about all first-hand accounts of the time verify this, were unquestionably Wellington's finest cavalry unit in the Peninsula. They were the eyes and ears of the army. They were the sorts of cavalrymen that you want.
Yeah.
And I think put into a brigade with them, the hope that the 1st Hussars of the King's German Legion might sort them out a bit. They had a spectacularly hopeless commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel the Honourable Henry Murray. The culture within the officer set was that it was party first, fight second. They got a lot of critique and commentary from a number of first-hand sources about how loose they were and what an unsoldierly set of fellows that they were.
Oh, no.
Murray managed to get them lost in the middle of the night on the way to on their way to an inspection so that they didn't arrive until after midnight, and all sorts of weird things went on. They were particularly ill-disciplined in the aftermath of Vittoria, ransacking the various French treasures there. When it came time, pardon me, to advance into France in the very late 1813, the inspecting officer wrote that he thought that they were unserviceable and shouldn't go, and Wellington had a particularly poor opinion of them. So they were a regiment that, despite all appearances, were not doing terribly well.
No.
Having said that, when they got to Waterloo in the middle of 1815, they had a new set of commanding field officers, and there is no reason to suggest they didn't do anything other than sterling service on the day. Obviously, the failure was not in the men, but obviously the culture that Henry Murray inculcated within his officers was not appropriate.
No.
The other group that I'm going to hit out on is the Household Cavalry Brigade, being the 1st and 2nd Life Guards and the Royal Horse Guards, who were sent out in a brigade to the Peninsula in 1813. These three regiments hadn't drawn their swords in anger since late 1794 in the Netherlands. So they'd had over 20 years of basically parade ground duty. They were totally unsuited for campaign. The commanding officer of the 2nd Life Guards was particularly hopeless. He was told to take all of his men down to a beach to put them through their drill because their drill was not good. He managed to get them to wheel around and go into the water.
Brilliant.
In late 1813, early 1814, 4 of their senior officers were forcibly retired because they weren't up to snuff. Again, there was nothing actually wrong with the troops, but they had spent too long in barracks, marching around in horse guards and up and down Whitehall, etc. Were not match fit for the Peninsula, basically.
Right.
Did not see any significant action in the latter part of the Peninsula. But obviously they did see significant action at Waterloo, but unfortunately they were as guilty as the Union Brigade of losing all control. But they certainly had probably improved there and did good service that day. So they're the two that I would pick upon. In terms of unheralded units that deserve more credit, I have to say that in putting together biographies of 104 infantry regiments, there are a whole bunch of no frills, honest to goodness county regiments that you sort of wouldn't think of twice, and you look at their record and you think, wow, those guys, they were good uns. And I won't provide a list here because it could well be a long list, but there's a lot of regiments that just went about their business, did it well, didn't attract too much attention, but they got picked for every campaign, and often they got picked for a campaign and they got put into reserve. The one way to work out the best units in any expeditionary force is look which units comprise the reserve. They'll be the good ones.
Now, Scots Greys! Now!
So there you have it, a crash course in how the British Army of the Napoleonic Wars was far stranger and more international than many of you will know. I certainly didn't. Massive thanks to Steve Brown for bringing the facts, the stats and the polite demolition of regimental mythology. If you want more deep dives like this, don't forget to hit subscribe, and if you're really keen, join my newsletter at redcoathistory.com/newsletter. When you do that, you'll get a free ebook about the Battle of Isandlwana, a place where I'm a qualified tour guide for. I'll see you in the next video. In the meantime, watch the one on screen now. I think you're going to really enjoy it.